Russia and the MAGA influencers are lying about the war in Ukraine. You've probably heard this one before. NATO provoked the war in Ukraine.
Yes, provoked the Russians to invade Ukraine with talk of NATO expansion.
This tired narrative has long been pushed by Russian propagandists, but lately it's been echoed by MAGA influencers and even by one Elon Musk. Because when I need geopolitical insights, I always turn to the guy who names his kid after a Wi-Fi password.
How do you say the name?
I mean, it's just X, the letter X, and then the AE is like pronounced Ash. Yeah. And then A12 is my contribution.
Oh, why A12?
Archangel 12, the precursor to the SR-71. Coolest plane ever.
And it's not just the US. Cypriot member of the European Parliament, Phidias, only using his first name because that's how everyone knows him, invited Jeffrey Sachs to talk about the topic in Brussels.
Jeffrey Sachs is about to give a talk here in the European Parliament. Enjoy it.
And who's Jeffrey Sachs? He's one of those people who blame the West for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You know, one of those mental gymnastic types. You know the type, people who can bend over backwards to defend Russia but pulls a hamstring trying to admit Ukraine might want democracy.
Oh, I know the kind of men you're talking about.
Anyway, these people are full of shit and I'm gonna tell you why.
Tell me why.
Ain't nothing but a heartache.
Tell me why.
The claim usually stems from a 1990 comment made by US Secretary of State James A. Baker to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, suggesting that NATO would move not 1 inch eastward if Russia accepted Germany's reunification, but even Gorbachev later clarified that no such promise was ever formally made.
Ich werde oft gefragt, warum das nicht vertraglich fixiert wurde, dass sich die NATO nicht nach Osten ausdehnt. Dazu sage ich, 1990 existierten noch NATO und Warschauer Pakt. Was sollte man da fixieren? Die Frage stellte sich gar nicht.
Ist es also ein Mythos, dass es entsprechende Zusagen des Westens gegeben habe?
Ja, das ist tatsächlich ein Mythos. Es konnte so eine Vereinbarung gar nicht geben.
Das heißt, sie wurden nicht betrogen?
Nein, nein.
In fact, that assurance was specifically about Germany and never codified in any binding agreement.
At the stroke of midnight German time, the two countries formally became one.
Fantastic time. It's very good. We like it.
Contrast that with the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which Ukraine actually gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances from the US, the UK, and Russia.
The presidents of the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and the United States of America, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will now sign the Memorandum on Security Assurances for Ukraine.
Assurances that Russia blatantly violated by invading Ukraine. NATO isn't some evil empire forcing countries to join. Nations like Poland, Estonia, and Lithuania chose to join NATO. You don't accidentally wake up in a NATO robe. It's not a cult. These countries ran towards the alliance like it was the last lifeboat on the Titanic.
Will you hold the boat? But I just have to run back to my room.
Sit down.
They joined because history taught them what happens when they don't have protection against countries like Russia. Russia wasn't provoked. These countries were simply protecting themselves from Russian imperialism.
The communists have been defeated. There will be a reversion to not communism, which has failed, but what I call a new despotism, which would pose a mortal danger to the rest of the world, because it would be infected with the virus of Russian imperialism, which of course has been a characteristic of Russian foreign policy for centuries.
A key moment came in 2008 during the NATO summit in Bucharest when the US pushed for Ukraine and Georgia to eventually join NATO.
Here in Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO and offers them a clear path forward to meet that goal.
This move enraged Vladimir Putin, who saw it as a threat to Russia's influence over its former empire.
The declaration that this process is not directed against Russia cannot satisfy us. National security cannot be built on promises.
Not long after, Russia invaded Georgia, an early warning sign of the kind of violence that would later be unleashed on Ukraine.
Вы знаете, что Россия присутствовала и присутствует на территории Грузии на абсолютно законных началах. И главной своей задачей мы считали и считаем сохранение мира.
But let's be clear, Russia doesn't need real reasons to invade. It just needs a story. And like any bad storyteller, they recycle the same plot. I'm not the villain, you made me do it.
Few saw it coming to this. Russia launching a war on its democratic neighbor. Vladimir Putin told Russian business leaders he had no option.
Over the years, Moscow has cycled through one justification after another. First, it was NATO expansion, then it was the so-called need for denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine.
И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
Each excuse is tailored to fit a particular narrative and audience.
Хохлонацисты. Поближе к телевизору подойдите. Ближе, ближе. Хорошо ли вам видно?
In fact, Russian state media hardly even talks about NATO expansion anymore. Why? Because it doesn't really work to rally Russians behind a brutal, drawn-out war. It's no longer useful as internal propaganda. I mean, Russian media dropped the NATO thing like a Netflix show after season 1. Not enough drama, not enough ratings, and too many plot holes.
Oh, I see what you did there.
Instead, they've moved on to more visceral, emotionally charged narratives designed to dehumanize Ukrainians and frame Russia as a victim.
Это просто звери и есть. Им не нужно подзаводиться для того, чтобы потерять человеческий облик. У них нет уже человеческого облика. Никого их не жаль. Вообще никого.
And that's where the cleverness of the Russian propaganda machine becomes obvious. It creates customized lies for different audiences across the world. For Russians, it's about Nazis and defending the motherland.
Потому что нахрен надо всю нацистскую сволочь уничтожить. Понятно зачем? Очистить. Вы когда-нибудь от клопов пытались избавиться?
For the American far right, it's about Christian persecution and about Zelensky being a dictator for postponing elections during wartime. Because, you know, the guy that's been in power for a couple of decades is definitely a legit president, so let's attack Zelensky.
You often ask, why don't the people of Ukraine rise against Zelensky's dictatorship?
For the far left, it's the neo-Nazi regime in Kyiv narrative, pushed by fringe communists and anti-imperialist influencers who are somehow siding with imperialist Russia.
This shit is getting out of hand.
Everybody is a Nazi these days, except for actual Nazis. In Ukraine, there's a group of people who use a Nazi symbol, who burn down World War II memorials, and for some reason, all these people that think everyone in the world is a Nazi support Ukraine.
Ukrainian far-right nationalism, ultra-nationalism is incredibly prominent. Shut the up. And also, these 1,000 people, the number keeps getting smaller and smaller, okay? But they're not the only battalion. They're just the one that got the most coverage, okay?
For the so-called intellectual class, there's the more sanitized version, the idea that NATO expansion caused this, a narrative popularized by people like John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, who have long carried water for the Kremlin, either knowingly or through ideological stubbornness.
Our basic view was we could shove NATO expansion down the Russians' throat. That's NATO expansion into Ukraine, just as we had shoved NATO expansion down their throat in 1999 and in 2004.
If you didn't want to be punched, why did you walk straight into my fist? Classic.
That makes a lot of sense.
And then, of course, there are the paid propagandists and useful idiots like Tucker Carlson.
My government, and your government particularly, are supporting this dictator in Ukraine who's oppressing Christians, who is banning people's native language and books in their native language. He's a book burner!
Tucker doesn't interview dictators, he auditions for their fan club. He will say anything to make Ukraine look bad and whitewash Russia's crime.
Zelensky himself is a very dark force. That is obvious if you watch him. It is unmistakable. Who could not see that? This man is a destroyer.
He doesn't care about truth, he cares about outrage, ratings, and pushing a narrative that undermines US support for democracy abroad.
I mean, I'm frustrated because I think that Zelensky is an enemy of the United States, and I think his government has tried to assassinate a number of people.
And now we're seeing the real consequences of how effective these narratives have been. The Trump administration is actively pushing to pull US troops out of Europe and drastically cut funding for NATO. In other words, they're trying to dismantle the very alliance that has kept Europe secure for decades.
They were sworn to stand together against aggression. An attack against one would be an attack against all.
This is not a coincidence. This is exactly what the Kremlin has wanted all along. Russia couldn't defeat NATO militarily, so it attacked the alliance with disinformation and influence campaigns. And it's working extremely well. If anything, Russia's aggression is what's pushing countries towards NATO. Their invasion of Ukraine caused neutral nations like Finland and Sweden to abandon decades of neutrality and join NATO.
Now virtually the entire society, and not just today, probably for generations, is turned against Russia because of its aggression.
Yet today, US figures are still parroting the idea that NATO provoked Russia. Elon Musk is fixated on the US leaving NATO, recycling falsehoods that were debunked years ago. These same talking points may soon be echoed again by President Trump.
I mean, it depends. We pay for military over in Europe. You know, we don't get reimbursed by much.
And the most alarming part of all this is that Russia will likely challenge the alliance within the next 5 years. It could happen in the Baltics, Finland, or even Poland. The plan is simple. The Kremlin will either claim oppression of Russian-speaking minorities in these countries or cite vague security concerns, then attempt to seize a small part of one of them.
Crimea officially became part of Russia Friday after Russian President Vladimir Putin signed the annexation into law.
Russia's security concerns are like saying you broke into someone's house because their locks made you feel unsafe. Logic, zero. Russian, very. Putin is betting that taking a small piece of, say, Latvia won't be seen as a big enough threat by countries like France, the US, or Turkey to justify sending troops to fight the Russians. That hesitation would massively damage NATO's credibility, maybe even lead to its collapse.
North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or more simply, NATO.
And all of this is possible because of Russia's massive online influence and manipulation campaigns, which have been running for over a decade.
But we were slow at identifying the type of new information operations.
When did you identify new operations?
It was right around the time of the 2016 election itself.
For too long, the West has underestimated Russia's capabilities in the information sphere, and now we're seeing the consequences. And just for the record, here's Vladimir Putin himself in a 2008 interview clearly stating that Crimea actually is Ukraine.
Крым не является никакой спорной территорией. И Россия давно признала границы сегодняшней Украины. Мы, по сути, закончили в целом и в общем наши переговоры по границе.
The idea that NATO expansion provoked Russia, it's no longer just a Russian talking point, it's become a Western anti-establishment mantra, spread by people who either don't understand history or are willfully ignoring it.
Почему вы не можете оторваться от нашей программы? Почему вы все время ее цитируете? Вам же запрещено нас смотреть. Соскучились по слову правды? Ну так внимайте.
But for now, I say goodbye, my friends and soup lovers. We'll meet again soon on the next episode of the Vatnik Soup.